Hello, I'm Barry Daniel, and this is the podcast of the Middle Way Society. Our aim is to encourage a universal approach to living a more integrated, ethical life, avoiding dogma or any appeal to authority. Our guest today is Margaret Wheatley. Margaret, or Meg as she prefers to be called, has worked globally in various roles since 1966, such as a speaker, teacher, community worker, consultant, advisor, and formal leader. She believes that leaders must evoke people's generosity, creativity, and community in a world that she feels is tearing us apart. A deep understanding of systems theory underpins her work, and she has written 9 books, including the classic Leadership and the New Science, her recent The Warrior Songline, as well as the recently updated Who Do We Choose to Be? Facing Reality, Claiming Leadership, Restoring Sanity, which will be the topic of our discussion today, which for me is an inspirational book on not only how to be a sane and compassionate leader in times of crisis and likely collapse, but also for anyone who would like to embrace perhaps a more pragmatic version of hope that is based on action, courage, presence, and responsibility rather than wishful thinking. Anyway, hello, Meg. Welcome to the Middle Way Society podcast.
I'm very happy we have this time together.
Smash it. Okay, well, perhaps I'm sure you've done this many times before, but just for anyone who's not familiar with you, could you perhaps tell us a bit about your background and
I'd be happy to. Yeah.
That led to our discussion today.
Thank you for the invitation. So in the bio, you heard that I started working out in the world in 1966. That was after I graduated with a very wonderful, strong liberal arts degree and went into the Peace Corps in post-war South Korea, time of great hardship. But I was there to teach, and it was my first introduction to a traditional Buddhist society, which made a great impact on me. And I look back now, it was a privilege to be in any traditional society because they're being destroyed at such a rate now. I've had a wonderful education. My doctorate is from Harvard, and that opens a lot of doors. I worked as a consultant for many years. I'm comfortable working at all levels of organizations with all levels of people in power from the highest. I've supported for several years the head of the U.S. Army, but also the director of the national parks in the U.S., Secretary of Education here. But I've always been able to work in community because that was my training in the Peace Corps when I was working in such a foreign situation, foreign alphabet, foreign food, foreign everything. As a young woman, I was 21. After that experience, my other Peace Corps volunteers and I looked at each other and said, we could go anywhere now. And that is true. I have never been hesitant to go into any community. I've worked a lot in Aboriginal communities in Australia, in South Africa and Zimbabwe, and some indigenous communities here in the US. I've never been hesitant. The physical surroundings have not been important to me. I've always known I'm going to meet another human being. And we have to break down the barriers. We have to break down the expectations. But it's been the consistent joy in my life to be able to travel and meet all sorts of people and not only find that common humanity, but actually to learn so much about the different ways we manifest culturally and in our different traditions. So I've had great exposure, such a rich life, and I have always written books from what I have observed. I've done research, but not in the way that's normally understood. I just get out into the world. I try and stay as awake and present as possible. People relate to me easily, so I learn a lot, and I just quickly develop a sense of what's happening. So I'm known as a systems thinker, and the way I want to apply that right now is I see on a very large scale what's going on. So all of my books have been an attempt to get us originally to change the paradigm. Could we stop organizing hierarchically and learning from chaos and complexity science? I have good training as a scientific mind, among other things. And could we understand that life organizes differently, that everything on this planet as a living system organizes through relationships, identity, and information? I thought it would be easy to change that paradigm from command and control. So one of the great lessons in my own journey is you don't change paradigms. People get more and more afraid, more resistant. And that's what I'm seeing now uh, in our whole approach to the coming collapse that we're in. It's already here in many discernible ways. But now my work on leadership, it has grown through all these books, and we're speaking about 32 years of writing and being out in the world in this way. I also raised a very large family, but that's another path. But what's happening now is I'm shifting from trying to shift a paradigm, which is futile work, if ever there was any, to really wanting people to understand, to remove the blinders of hope and the blinders of denial, and really notice what's going on, not to plunge into despair and grief, because that's has to happen when you first take in truly the horrors of this world and the banality and the greed and the complete disregard for human life on the part of leaders in far too many places, where I've lived in some of those places. So I started summoning, and that's the right word for my work, summoning people to see what's going on so that you could choose. This is why my most recent book is Who Do You Choose to Be? You can choose a path of service and contribution. And I named that being a warrior for the human spirit. And this is very meaningful work, not only to me, but to those who really undertake this commitment and this dedication. And I offer a lot of different ways to train, have been doing this now for 8 years. And I just know what I'm doing is important, is a culmination of where I've been and who I've known. And I'm just trying to summon more people to what is essentially a very noble role and a meaningful role once you face where we are.
Right. Well, I feel like you've summoned me, Meg. And you asked me a question just before we started that your colleague did. That is anything that I was particularly interested in, in relation to your work, because I think I first was drawn to you because of your history in systems thinking, and like the middle way for us is a principle of judgment. However, we see a lot of resonance with systems theory, and so
I have to interrupt you for a moment. I just assumed you're a Buddhist with that title, but tell me more about the society, please.
Yeah, well, we draw a lot from the Buddhist tradition, and but perhaps see the middle way as the overarching principle stems from that tradition. But
Yeah.
the middle way has found expression in throughout history in various forms.
Yes, yes.
So see it far more as a universal principle. So that's where we're coming from. But I was really interested in just talking to you about your concern for ethics in general.
Yes.
Yeah,
I'm quite in touch with the British news. And then, of course, I live in the US, which is just an unfolding disaster and tragedy.
yeah,
So let's look at this. I use ethics and the not only the decline in morality, but the dismissal of it as important. So you have this experience in the UK. The leader says something in public. It's on video. 2 months later, maybe 2 weeks later, at this rate of change, they say something completely contrary. And then when a reporter or a thoughtful citizen points it out to them, they go, oh, I never said that. That's one of the, or that's not, you interpreted it wrong, or you're just trying to blame me, right? So there's no ground of rational behavior.
accountability.
And so it leads to absolute I mean, it's so Orwellian, the environment that we're in now of constant lying that is actually, it's also in the book. There are deliberate campaigns of disinformation now from many sources, but primarily from Russia, who's been doing this since the 1980s with great effect, to create confusion so nobody knows what's real. And when we're confused, we get angry, cynical, and we withdraw, or we just submit to authoritarian leadership. That's so clearly happening. When I look at the loss of ethics, I'm using it not as a solution, not with a solution focus, because we can't solve these big systems now. We cannot. We have to do what we can, where we are with what we have. That's a quote from President Theodore Roosevelt. And I find it extremely useful. But to notice our current culture and the prevalent dynamics has been my work, so that I can choose work that will be supportive, helpful, and make a difference. But that work keeps shrinking in scope. You know, I used to work at very high levels of government. You know, just wave my hand to dismiss that, right? But all of us have to, if we're interested in making a difference, if we're interested in restoring ethical behavior, which I am, the only place where that has any potential for success is at the community level, within our local communities. And for me, that's the only place where we can expect to have impact. So I work with this quote from Brother David Steindl-Rast, who's been one of the great spiritual leaders of this time, who focused many of us on gratitude. And Brother David at one point said, ethics is how we behave when we decide we belong together.
Yeah, and I love that. And
Yes.
I think that's in many ways the grounding of ethics. But sometimes I think, you know, if you see an ethical strategy as one that helps you to make better judgments, I think you can even get blindsided when you're well-meaning. So, like, I've been involved a few years, three years ago. I got involved in the XR movement in the UK when there was large-scale disruptive action. It was non-violent, but and I personally got arrested. I basically chained myself to someone else, and we blocked a road where these oil and gas companies were shoring up their their subsidies for the next 30 years. And at the time, it felt there was a real sort of momentum for me. And but I was nevertheless uncomfortable with a lot of the thinking within the group, and a lot of it was quite aggressive in the language that was being used, and also language that was unhelpful, and language that just basically turned people off. And so it's almost like, although they're coming from a very compassionate take on things, they still had sort of fixed beliefs about weight. They weren't thinking, to use a term of yours, sanely. And
so where did you take your passion after that experience, when you realized that it was the means were not congruent with the deeper values? Where did you end up after that?
Well, I got a bit stuck, to be honest, Margaret. Because I think, a lot of people in this, a lot of people in that particular movement, really care, and also sort of really believe in the science, and a lot of it's good science, like systems thinking, but also a lot of people think, well, we can just use the present way of thinking about science, the almost reductive way of thinking, to outsmart our way out of the situation. And so I got a bit disillusioned with that. So I was what I do as I remain involved in the Green Party here, which takes a lot more they're a lot more grounded approach to the situation, and in some ways it feels like an island of sanity. There are thinkers there, believe people have a similar view about hope that you have, that you're doing good in order to good. I really love that Václav Havel
quote. Yes, that's it.
That nailed it for me. So should I just say it's not the, correct me, I'll get the idea.
Let me say it rather than correct you. It's not the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something is worth doing no matter how it turns out. So it's that certainty that I'm doing the right work, and I am increasingly free of expectations about success, because it's the expectation. Let's go back to this example of your own experience. It's the clear seeing of what's wrong that is innately enraging, right? But then what do you do with your anger? What do you do with your grief? Because, as you alluded to, and somewhat differently, if we just take our anger onto the streets, civil disobedience, doing even physical harm to buildings and things with our anger, what do we end up with, or who do we become? We become angry, bitter, cynical people. Have we created change? No. The only thing that's changed is us. And that's why there is such a need to be grounded in a really clear sense of non-aggression. And so all of these movements, the whole environmental movement for many years, getting a little better now, people were just fighting with one another. They were competing for scarce resources. They were blaming one another. That dynamic is in the culture. It's in the air and water, I think, of blame and frustration and powerlessness. But how do we deal with those? That's where I chose to develop this sense of spiritual warrior, where I am committed not only to nonviolence, I'm committed to non-aggression in my personal relationships as I'm working with colleagues. That's really hard. So in order to do that, I have to train. I have to train to develop a stable mind. I have to be aware of what triggers me, and so I don't get so triggered. And I have to be with others who have the same basic ethics, the same basic ethics.
Well, Meg, you've sort of unstuck me.
Oh,
Because
good.
but I would say though that the XR was really committed to non-violence, and I, that it was more a sense of concern than anger, even that was impotent.
Right.
Certainly was the sentiment a lot of people there. However, I've spoken about you, and then also there's another guy called Federico Campagno. Have you heard of him?
I don't know Federico. No.
I'll speak about him briefly later, but he's someone you might be interested in. He thinks in very similar terms. But anyway, I have spoken to you to some people in that movement, and their fear is it's like it feels like I would be giving up, because they're so aware of the situation and they feel that at least they're trying. But I'm saying, well, you're not saying stop trying by any means.
I'm not saying stop trying. I'm saying give it your all, give it your utmost, but be free of any expectation that you're going to create change. And that's the big difference. That's the Václav Havel difference, right? We're not doing it because we think we're going to stop this rampant, deliberate destruction of the planet by oil companies. They don't care. No. Too many leaders don't care. So we have to oppose them, but we have to not, free of expectations. We oppose them. We give louder, clearer voice, but we're not being eaten up alive by our own anger. And there is the realization, I know it's extremely painful and hard to hear what I'm about to say. We're not pulling out of this, folks. We are not. We are on a death spiral with things like the behavior of oil companies, with the climate just acting out of its own laws, which we thought we could ignore, and we can. So the question is, where do I want to give my best self, my highest qualities of being human? And I'll say one more thing about anger is an old Buddhist teaching that anger is like getting angry at somebody is like eating rat poison and expecting it's going to kill the rat. The anger doesn't harm the other person. It does poison us, and it really destroys our health, our sense of well-being, and it devolves quite quickly into real cynicism and sometimes suicide even.
Yeah.
I mean, I would just want to emphasize, because I know the brutality of what I just said. We are not pulling out of this. We're not. There are many places you can learn this, but then the question is, who do I choose to be? Mm-hmm. I want to be the best human being, the most generous, compassionate, and creative person I can be in service to others. That's the meaning of life right there.
Yeah, that's great. Meg. Just read you a little bit by this guy, Federico Campagno, that also inspired me. He said something very similar to you. He said, sometimes you are born in the ending of a world, and this has happened many times before. And he says the diagnosis for this is that the future no longer works. Normally, when we talk about the future, it's an extension of the story that we're born into. If you're born into the ending of that story, then attempts to extend it no longer convince anyone. You can see in the last few years the political manifestation of the failure of the future, and the appeal of the past is so powerful because in some sense this world is coming to an end. He says if you recognize this, then you say to yourself, like you, Meg, well, what's worth doing? What's needed? And he says you can stop trying to make sense of the logic of the world that is coming to an end and start trying to create good ruins. What might what might
I
be
wasn't
helpful,
expecting that.
great, isn't it? What might be helpful to the people beyond the end of this world, things that are fertile and full of possibility. So it's that this is not giving up on the future, but just giving up on the future as a projection of the way we've been doing things.
Okay, and I'm just going to say we need to give up on the future and come into the present moment where there's so much work to be done of a deeply human work needs to be done. We need to support one another. We need to reduce conflict. We need to reduce fear wherever we can, including in ourselves. We need to, we need to midwife this, not just pretend that we're going to get through it. This is a dying planet. It's not just a dying culture, it's a dying planet. And so many of the things that I read take no account of what's happening on the planet, unless you're talking to an indigenous person, and then there's great wisdom there. But we're not trying to make ourselves feel better. I want us to be better people. And this is where I rely on every spiritual tradition that's been there. And what is end of life? What's meaningful at the end of life? I think if everyone contemplated that, many have had the experience of being with a dying person. What are they talking about at the end of their life?
Yeah.
Really, it's not that they failed, it's they want to focus on where did they love and how much love was available because of their life. And, I sound more and more to myself like a preacher, because this is the basic truth of human existence that all of our spiritual traditions tell us. And we're coming out of this great disappointment and anger that the world we wanted, it never worked for most people, but the world we wanted has been taken away from us. And I was really taken by Federico's phrase, the failure of the future. Well, that's an interesting concept for me, but I'm not putting any blame. One Australian writer called us future eaters. The way we behave, still do, just destroys the future. We have destroyed the future. It's not that it's failed. We're living with consequences in the now. We're living with consequences that were predicted. And how we relate, whether we just try and, do better in the ruins, or a new book that I forget the author of, is I Want a Better Collapse. We're looking for what's possible within this happening now scenario of failures and collapse of systems, and especially ecosystems and political and health systems, educational systems. They're all collapsing. They're not going to be fixed. But how do I approach this life where what I thought I would have is no longer available? Well, that's where we come back to the basics of when a human being is facing their death. What becomes important? Same level of scale. You could take that to any level of scale.
That's really, again, really interesting. It reminds me of a talk I was listening to recently by this Scottish guy called Dougal Tyne, and he says sometimes we make a category error between a problem and a predicament. So he
Yes,
says,
I've heard him cite it. I love that.
brilliant, isn't it? Yeah.
Yes.
Just for the listeners, I'll just briefly say
Finish
that.
it, please.
A problem is something to solve. However, a predicament is something like what you just saying, Meg, your own mortality, and that perhaps what we're experiencing now is a predicament, and it would be better. And I think you're suggesting we deal with it in a similar way, like we deal with our mortality. Civilizations tend to last 300-400 years, as you say in your book, roughly around 10
Yeah,
generations.
I go with 250 with Sir John Glubb's 10 generations. Yeah.
But they tend, there have been occasions when they've lasted longer, but as a general rule, they last around.
There are different estimates, but I want to just stress again, when we face reality. So now I'm going through the subtitles of my book, Who Do We Choose to Be? The first thing is to face reality. That is extremely painful, saddening, overwhelming. And then, because we have strong human spirits, rather than, you just disappeared on my screen, Barry. Oh, there you are. Okay. Because we are human spirits capable of great nobility and caring and compassion, once we really face reality, then my second subtitle is we need to claim leadership. What am I going to do to help other people? How am I going to serve and not get lost in my own neuroses or dilemmas or grief or self-focus, whatever form it is? And then the key, which I would change that subtitle now, it says restoring sanity. I would say restoring humanity.
I like that. Yeah.
And you're the first person to hear that. Yeah, but it is what, my definition of sanity is, creating the conditions for people to be generous, creative, and kind. So that's a definition of our best human qualities. But in all of this, coming back to what is needed now and how I might contribute is very satisfying. It's very meaningful, and it takes us out of the fear and the grief and the rage that we genuinely, understandably feel. So the predicament is these problems cannot be solved. And when you take when you develop an understanding through the science, through social science, through human behavior, you see the trend lines. There's no way to counteract or even slow them down at this point. So we're not going to create the change we wanted to be in the world. Now we have to be in the world as fully wonderful human beings, no matter what's going on. So for me, all the stories from wartime are very valuable now, because in those absolutely disastrous, death-awaiting conditions, people who showed their best human qualities of compassion and service, we do remember them.
Yeah. Just on that, what you said about humanity, that really struck a chord with me, because I'm a Samaritan. I think you have a similar service in the US.
Yeah.
And that's, to me, is an island of sanity, and not just and what the strength there is, that we don't have any answers, we don't have a message. We're just one human being trying to make a connection with another human being, and that's so powerful.
That's perfect.
Yeah. So is there anything else you want to say about the book, Meg?
No, I think I've said quite enough, and I think I've given what for me is my essential summoning call to people is we have, we must be truthful and honest about what's happening. We can see it in our families, we can see it in our lands, we can see it in the atmosphere, we can see it everywhere. And then the question is truly, who do I choose to be?
Wonderful. Well, my last question, which I always ask people, what is your understanding of the middle way, Meg, and how it might relate, or potentially be helpful to what we've been talking about today?
Thank you. That's a great question. I am Buddhist. I'm well-trained, well-disciplined Buddhist for over 30 years. I think the middle way for me is staying open and present and not being torn in one direction or another by circumstances, by what's going on, as I've just said many times. But finding a path where it's possible to be grounded, to stay open, curious, because you're not, you have an intention and a discipline to not be torn apart or ripped off your path by strong emotions, terrible circumstances. I mean, for me, it's a quality of presence, and openness is a key part of being present, the fundamentals to being present. So
fantastic.
So I wish you all well in this pursuit, commitment to the middle way. It's so important.
Thank you very much. A very last question. If people wanted to find out more about your work, Meg.
Easy. You go to margaretwheatley.com. And fantastic. There you can read, you can learn about my books, you can see excerpts, there's a lot of, it's designed as a resource for people. Yeah. So margaretwheatley.com, easy to get to.
Okay. Well, it's been a pleasure and an honor to speak to you today, Meg. Thank you so much for giving up your time today.
Now, I didn't give up my time. I contributed in service to all of you, which is my work. So
Great.
Thank you very much. Blessings for us all.
You can find out more about Middle Way philosophy at www.middlewaysociety.org.